I greet you with the Islamic greeting of peace. Good afternoon. I hope everyone's doing well today. It's a pleasure to have you all join us for part 2 of Life in Occupied Palestine, Eyewitnesses, Stories, and Photos. And it's an honor to have our esteemed guest, Anna Baltzer, today. Anna was raised in Berkeley, California, and Austin, Texas. She graduated from Columbia University with a degree in mathematics and economics, but today she divides her time between teaching, traveling, and activism. Anna first traveled to the Middle East in 2003 while on a Fulbright grant in Turkey. Since then, she has traveled to the West Bank every year as a volunteer for the International Women's Peace Service, documenting human rights abuses and supporting nonviolent resistance to the occupation. Without further ado, Anna Baltzer.
Which one do I speak into? Okay. Thanks so much for being here, everyone. It has really been a delight so far, and I'm happy to have a chance to also show some photographs and maps that I think really illustrate better than words can what is going on here, and also to show some of the faces behind all of these stories, that it's not simply about people like myself and Dr. Pape, Jewish people speaking out against what's happening, but that these are real people with real stories, with voices, and those voices should be heard. Let's see. I get to skip over a lot of the stuff because I talked about it in the presentation out there. What I'm going to do is start out with giving you a visual for what I began to describe in the talk out there, namely that process of what I call what is rightfully known as the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. In other words, the removal of the Christian and Muslim population from the area. These are going to be 4 maps showing that transfer of land. What I'm going to do essentially is to begin with this so that we can see a framework, and then I'm going to talk about my personal expertise, namely what's happening within the occupied territories themselves and how that process continues. But just as sort of a history, and again, Dr. Pape will talk about this in much more detail and is much better equipped than I am to talk about it tonight. So back in 1946, a short time, a little over 60 years ago, Jewish immigrants had acquired about 8% of the land in the area. They were largely coming from Europe, either because they were wishing to create a Jewish state in the area, or because they had nowhere else to go, and this was the only place open to them. My grandmother, for example, wanted to go to Palestine but couldn't, as she was fleeing the Nazis. In 1940, and this was in juxtaposition to the Palestinian Jewish population, the indigenous population, who were largely anti-Zionist. And as I said before, there was relative harmony between the Jews, Muslims, and Christians in the area before the introduction of this idea of an ethnically exclusive state. In 1947 then, after tremendous persecution of Jewish people, not only in Nazi Europe, but throughout history, throughout the world, the United Nations proposed to give Jewish people 54% of the land in the area, the white places here, so that they could have a Jewish state. And that left Palestinians with about 46% of the land in the area. Imagine you're Palestinian, and you are being offered by an entity that doesn't actually own your land. You're being offered about half of what you kind of thought was already yours, The Palestinians didn't think this was particularly generous. And likewise, Zionist forces had a big problem. So there were no Israelis yet because there was no state of Israel, but pro-Jewish state Zionist forces were happy that there had been partition. It was a big gain from 8 to 54%, and they were happy about that. They had been lobbying for it in the United Nations, for example. But they had a major problem, and that is that they wished to create a Jewish state. And the majority of the people there just weren't Jewish. There were all of these Christians and Muslims who were living there. And you can't have a Jewish state without a Jewish majority. And so Zionist forces proceeded to expel the majority of the Christian and Muslim populations from the area. The expulsions, which Dr. Pape is really one of the world experts on, and his book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, outlines systematically, one by one, what was done, going through the Israeli archives themselves. So I won't talk much about that. But the expulsions, which involved, surrounding villages, pillaging them, there were massacres, rapes, etc., went beyond this 54% that was proposed to be a Jewish state into about 78% of the land. Now, about halfway through this process of ethnic cleansing, Zionist forces then declared this is going to be the state of Israel. and surrounding Arab countries into which now hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were fleeing intervened in the area, not, by the way, in the areas that were proposed to be a Jewish state, but in those that were proposed even to be an Arab state, past which Zionist forces had crossed. Anyway, they were totally unsuccessful. They were also outnumbered, also with regard to military. And a big sort of myth that I learned was that Zionists were totally at a disadvantage, and that's incorrect. Anyway, they were unsuccessful, the Arab countries, and that process really continued up until early 1949, by which finally there was a Jewish majority in the area. And still today there is a Jewish majority, but as I said before, it is an artificial majority. It is one that cannot be taken out of context. It's a majority that was created by kicking out the non-Jews, and it is maintained by making life so difficult for people that if they're not Jewish, they choose to leave if they can. Many of them do. Anyway, so this was up until 1967, when Israel occupied all remaining Palestinian lands, namely the West Bank here, the big one on the right, and then the Gaza Strip here, and also East Jerusalem was annexed. But anyway, I was living in the West Bank, and the stories and maps from my talk are from the West Bank, so keep that shape of the West Bank in your head. You'll be seeing a lot of maps of it. Through this occupation in 1967, up until the present, over the past 40 years, what we've seen really is the continuation of this process of land transfer. And you can see, for example, now the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and how the areas for the Christian and Muslim populations are sort of continuously dwindling into what are now sort of ghettos or reservations, Bantustans. And I show this for a lot of reasons, but a main one is that a lot of times people talk about the occupation, as if somehow if we went back to 1967, everything would be fine, just end the occupation. But really the occupation is but one step in a larger process that has been going on a lot longer than 40 years. And I think we need to recognize it as such. But anyway, I'll be focusing on the West Bank where I was living. So how has Israel over the past 40 years continued that process? It wasn't through, as in 47 to 49, an outright expulsion of the population. So how does that occupation manifest itself? What would it feel like if Irvine, California were under a foreign military occupation? Let's begin to explore what that word occupation even means. So one way is by populating the area with its own citizens. So Israel has begun to populate now the West Bank and previously Gaza with towns and colonies for its own population only. So these are villages, sometimes larger cities. Here's a large one near Bethlehem in East Jerusalem, for example, that are exclusively for Jewish Israelis. This is, of course, within the West Bank, internationally recognized Palestinian land. The farmers who own this land here can usually show you, their land deeds. And yet there's the city that's been built right on top of that land that is exclusively for Jewish Israelis. Now this process that Israel is doing of populating another area with its own citizens, this is nothing new. This is not a new kind of a situation. As Dr. Pape said, it has happened before, and there's a word for it. It's called colonization. And this kind of colonization is illegal according to international law, and yet Israel has not only allowed it to happen, but oftentimes actively promotes it. So here, for example, you can see a billboard on an Israeli road in the West Bank. It's in Hebrew, and it says essentially, first of all, now more than ever, and then underneath it explains, if you move to our community, to Ariel, which is a settlement, if you move to Ariel, you will be rewarded with 100,000 Israeli shekels, which is between 20 and 25,000 US dollars. In other words, the Israeli government is actually paying its own citizens to move from Israel into the occupied West Bank to become part of this new occupying population. And so for me, this is really a critical thing to recognize. Yes, it is always tempting to see these things in terms of a big religious war